So welcome to our Themes of the New Economy presentation for this quarter. We try to do one of these every quarter. And really the routine, if you haven't figured it out, we pull one of our analysts or portfolio managers kind of at their desk, and we say, we need you to just explain to us what's going on in a certain area, a certain theme that you're already researching. So Reggie, who covers energy for us, he thought it would be a timely time to talk about the state of global energy. So we have Reggie Smith joining us. He's one of our research analysts here, always informing us of what's going on in the energy market. So we're excited, and this is information dense, this presentation. So there's a lot, because there's a lot going on in order to understand the state of global energy. So Reggie, go ahead and go to the disclosure slide. We actually use a lot of third-party data and information in this, and we believe this data to be accurate and reliable. However, it's not produced by us, and so we have not ran it through our own departments, but we're presenting it to you. So just know that that's a part of this presentation, is that we're using kind of third-party research, and while we believe that it's informed and reliable, that we did not produce it ourselves. So with that, Reggie, I'm going to turn it over to you and just let you take us through your presentation, explain to us what's going on with the global state of energy.
Thanks so much, Sean. It's great to be with you this afternoon and talk about energy. I would like to start by maybe just saying energy is the lifeblood of the economy. It's extremely critical to everything that we do, and I think we're all aware of that. And so our first slide here is energy is back, meaning it's at top of mind. Are we going to have energy? How much are we going to pay for energy? These are questions that we're all considering. Of course, without energy, hospitals can't run, food can't be made or delivered, people can't get to work, and we can't heat or cool our homes to deal with extreme weather. And at Eventide, we take energy very seriously. And so I'm excited to talk about all the things that are happening in the energy world right now. And as Sean said, there's so much that we could look at. I'm going to try to focus us in on the major themes. Every slide we could sit at and talk for at least 20 minutes, but we obviously won't have time for that. So we'll jump right in. It seems as though we forgot for a little bit how important energy is as we are dealing with this. And this is a slide of the Brent crude price of oil. So this shows us about 2 years worth of history. And it's amazing from one chart how much you can predict or assume about what's going on in the world, because energy, of course, is an input to so much in the economy. So Brent is an exchange that prices about 2/3 of the world's oil, and prices were very low in March 2020 during the start of the pandemic. You might have remembered that prices had gone negative at one point, and then since then have been steadily rising. They more than tripled to over $120 per barrel. And as of August 23rd, it was about $100 per barrel. Prices have since come down a bit, but this has had major implications. And I'm sure you at home have felt the price of, or the impact of this rising cost. If we look at things from a historical view, we can see that this price increase is historical. It is one of the major price increases of the last 70 years. And there's really three major periods of price increase, two excluding the one that we're in right now. So you might remember there was a lack of supply heading into what would become the Great Financial Crisis, a period of strong economic growth that was only reduced by the actual recession. But then prices quickly rebounded back up. And then the Iranian Revolution produced a period in the early 1980s of extremely high oil prices. Now, as we go through this, I want you to think about what are factors that could potentially bring prices back down or lead to something like we've had in the past where prices stay high for a long period of time. And we're going to look at what is driving these energy prices. Now, energy scarcity is everywhere right now. It's a bit hard for me to exaggerate just how much suffering from the lack of energy is going on in the world. In fact, it's hard to find a country that hasn't had a protest or riot or upheaval over energy. Ecuador, shown here on the right, had a huge protest that ended with the government mandating lower oil prices. South Africa, Pakistan, Panama, Cameroon, Ghana, Argentina, Peru, Netherlands, Sri Lanka ran their president out of the country. There's been upheaval around the world. This picture here on the left shows London demonstrators here saying, will we have enough money to heat our home or to eat, implying that they'll have to make a trade-off. It is truly a global crisis that we're going through right now. Now, before we dive in, I'd like to introduce just our sources of energy so we're all on the same page. Generally, we have about 8 sources of energy. So on the left, I have coal, oil, and natural gas. These are what we typically call fossil fuels, and they provide most of the world's energy. And then on the right, I have what are typically considered clean energy sources because of their limited pollution or carbon emission characteristics. So we have nuclear, which is capturing the energy released when you split an atom. Bio, which is really wood energy. Hydropower, which is, of course, leveraging water to produce power. Wind, using the wind. Solar, using the sun. So these are our sources. And when we break that down and we say, okay, where do we actually get our energy from? It turns out that we get 81% from coal, gas, and oil. And going forward, we're going to focus on 31%, which is oil. So 31% of the world's energy comes from oil. It is the most critical piece of energy that we have. Okay, and you might notice that solar and wind are only about 2%, even though they are growing the fastest of all these sources. They only make up 2% of the world's energy supply. Now, I wanted to say, okay, if we could take all the energy that the world needs in a given year and convert that to barrels of oil, it's 91 billion barrels of oil. Now, I'm not even sure really how to conceptualize that. All I know is that's a lot of energy. Okay, so what is causing the energy crisis? There's a lot of causes, no simple cures. We're going to dive into each one of these factors. So on the top here, I've listed 6 factors on the supply side, things that are limiting supply. That's why I have the negative S there. There are things that are limiting our supply of oil. And the first thing that we'll spend some time talking about is capital discipline. This is has led to us missing out essentially on production, and underinvestment in the energy space has led to us missing out on production that we would have today. But because we didn't invest 5 years ago, we don't have that. There's policy and market uncertainty. There's incentives with those who provide oil to keep prices high. The Russia-Ukraine war has dislocated energy flows. There's been a refining limitation. And there's also been supply chain bottlenecks that are impacting producers. And then on the demand side, things that have led to outsized demand are extreme weather and, of course, population growth and economic growth. So we're going to dive into these. So first, underinvestment. This shows global spending on oil extraction going back the last 10 years. And you can see that in the first part of last decade, there was a lot of spending on oil extraction, but it slowly went down and it really cratered during the pandemic. And of course, when you don't invest to increase, when you reduce investment, you gradually over time reduce your production capability. And so that is what we've seen. Now, there is sort of a rebound here, but notice that the rebound does not take us back to levels before. So that is a bit of a warning. Now, to show you why we're not investing as much into growing production, I want to tell you a little story. I want to take you through a little history of US oil production. So this shows us how much oil the US has produced since 1990. Notice it was just under 8 million barrels per day. That's the MBPD, 8 million barrels per day in 1990. Now in 2010, we had slid all the way down to just over 5 million barrels per day. Now at that time, I was in college, and one of my professors and our whole class were talking about the potential end of oil. We were talking about how the world was running out of oil, how the US was running out of oil. And at this point, we had been through a period where prices reached $189 per barrel. Now, we just talked about how they were 100. So this was very bad. And Sean, I'm curious to ask you, where do you think production went from here?
Well, I'm just going to go with the obvious, the trend line. I don't know what would have changed to make it reverse course. So I'm going to say continue to go down.
Okay. All right. So Sean, let's see what happened. Boom.
Don't ask me questions that you know I'm going to get wrong, Reggie. Don't do that again. It's embarrassing.
So this is what happened. Truly remarkable. It probably is the greatest energy revolution of our lifetimes. Oil production in the US increased 2.5 times to about 13 million barrels per day. And this was over a very short amount of time, 10 years. Now, there were some boom and bust cycles. You can see a bust where production went down here in 2015. But oil prices came down. They cratered to $42 a barrel in 2016. And that's an inflation-adjusted price. So you can see that there was this huge supply that hit out of nowhere that really brought about a new pricing regime. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. But what drove that huge production increase was US shale. Shale is rock formations generally 1 to 2 miles below the surface that are very rich in oil or oil and natural gas, or sometimes just natural gas. The primary gas basins are called the Marcellus Shale up here in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Ones that are rich in oil with some gas are in Texas, the Barnett Shale, the Permian Basin, Eagle Ford. You might have heard of these on the news, but these are major producing areas. There's a gentleman named George Mitchell that pioneered fracking technology where you drill down and are actually able to create little cracks in this rock formation. And then using pressure and tons of pipe, you're able to, of course, pull that oil and gas out of the ground. He was working on this in the 80s and 90s, but it was a gentleman later really in the last 20 years named Aubrey McClendon who really got financing to the industry. And that's why we're the beneficiaries largely of this shale revolution. This was huge for oil markets and for what is often termed energy independence. The US went from literally being middle of the pack in oil production to number one in a 10-year time period. We were beating out Iraq and Canada, but we surpassed Russia and even Saudi Arabia in 2019. So this had huge implications for pricing. Of course, as production went up, pricing came down, and we have been living in an era of relatively low and stable pricing. This is what we've been the beneficiary of for the last 7 to 8 years. Of course, before that, pricing was very high, as we've been noting. Now, there was one major problem with the shale revolution, and that is it was not very profitable. Companies were taking on lots of debt. It was a drill, baby, drill mentality. And when prices collapsed in 2015, well, there were many bankruptcies and there was consolidation and prices, of course, stayed low. It was almost as if the industry forgot that if you increase supply dramatically, you're going to lose your ability to harvest profits because pricing will collapse. And so this estimate has about $340 billion have been spent or have been sort of eaten through by the industry. They've sort of been burned in terms of funding this growth. And I say burned, it's a measure of the free cash flow burn. Free cash flow is a financial term that measures how much cash a business generates that's available to debt and equity investors. And this is saying that, well, they weren't generating free cash flow for investors, and they were actually burning through cash flow. And of course, they were doing that because they were taking all of their cash from operations, or a substantial portion, at least 77% or 80%, and funneling that back into growth. And so it was growth at all cost mentality. Now, today, this is no longer the case. Investors want to get paid. They want to earn a return for the money that they're investing into the shale patch. And we can see that cash flows have now turned positive. So instead of taking that cash from operations and putting it back into the business for expansive growth, they're paying out dividends, they're buying back shares, they're paying down debt. Another way of looking at this is that the industry is simply maturing. It is no longer a venture capital mindset, take a bunch of money, try to grow market share. It's now about having a solid business that is somewhat impermeable to boom and bust cycles, and that can generate a return for investors. And so this, of course, is constraining production in an era where prices are rising. So prices are now rising, right? And there isn't the same response. And we can think about the market history in terms of three major cycles. So the first period we talked about, where production was going down in the US. The second period was the shale revolution, or the shale boom. But now we're in this third period where, yes, production is increasing, but we don't expect to add 1 or 2 countries worth of oil. Companies are not responding that way anymore. It's a different industry. There's also other factors. For example, some of the best sites have already been drilled. There's other limitations, but this is one of the driving ones. And it's very important for us to understand that the production cycle, the production response is different this time. Now, another thing that's driving decreased supply is just uncertainty. This shows oil market growth, if you will, or in some cases decline in million barrels per day. This is on a global scale. The world consumes about 100 million barrels of oil per day. And what this shows from very smart people at all of these companies, what they're predicting. For example, here at BP, they're showing roughly flat and then declining oil production. Some show slight increase, but the major takeaway here is that we don't know what government regulations will occur that might limit oil. We don't know how quickly EVs will be deployed. We don't know how much population and economies will grow. And so we're not too sure. And that makes investments difficult. The other piece here is that we have seen regulation limit production. So I'll start with the MVP pipeline. This is a pipeline that was supposed to take gas from that Marcellus shale part of Pennsylvania and take it to Virginia. This pipeline has been held up with all types of environmental hoops to jump through, cancellations from courts. And I want to point this one out because in the Marcellus Shale right now, producers can only take away 35 billion cubic feet of gas per day. It's a lot of gas, 35 billion cubic feet per day. But they're producing 34 billion cubic feet right now, which means even if they wanted to grow production, there would be no place to put that production. So they simply can't. California announced a ban on gas cars beginning in 2035. That will change demand for oil. The Biden administration has sort of started and stopped oil and gas leasing. Of course, you need leasing to acquire land, to drill. And if that is starting and stopping, that disrupts your business. And there has also been a divestment movement from fossil fuel producing companies. And what this does is not only signals a lack of appetite for growth in the industry, but it also can raise the cost of capital, the cost of money to actually grow that business or grow that production, which means companies need to increase returns, for example, by paying dividends and not growing production to attract investors to that investment. And that, of course, means that you focus on share buybacks and dividends and not on growing your production. Importantly, OPEC benefits largely from high prices. This is OPEC plus, so nations that have formed a consortium to try to control and regulate the oil markets. Saudi Aramco, the world's largest oil company, had a profit of $48.4 billion last quarter, up from about $25 billion the year before. They are rolling in cash, as many other companies and countries that have national oil companies are as well. And they want to keep it that way. So they don't want prices to crash. That, of course, would come by increasing supply to a point that would flood the market with excess oil. Russia, of course, has had a big impact on this. They've facilitated price increases for sure. Now, interestingly, since 2019 to now, their exports have only gone down 200,000 barrels per day. Now, you can see that, like many other producers, they went down during the depths of the pandemic and have slowly been increasing. But there's a couple things I want to point out. One, that as North America and Europe have shunned oil exports, they've shunned using Russian oil, India and China have consumed that oil. They've essentially replaced the Western countries in consuming Russian oil. And then two, even though exports have remained roughly flat, slightly down since sanctions were implemented, note that they have not grown even in a high-priced environment. So sanctions are probably keeping a lid on how much Russia exports, but they're not taking Russian oil off of the market as of yet. That might change. One of the lesser known issues impacting the oil market is refining. Now, when you produce crude oil or sort of raw oil, you need to refine it. You have to make it usable. When we go and fill up our oil tanks, we use refined oil. We use oil that has been processed. And these process facilities were taken offline during COVID because utilization, when the world was stuck at home, went very low, and these units were no longer profitable. Some might have been old or in disrepair. And so in the natural replacement cycle of refining capacity, there was a round of shut-ins, if you will. And you can see that dip here on the right. I'm showing this chart where you can see refinery capacity going down to levels we had not seen in quite some time, right when the world, of course, was starting to open up. Right here. And of course, there is a rebound depicted here, but we have to wait for it. What this bottleneck did was lead to a spike in pricing. Of course, when you have a bottleneck and very limited supply of something, the price for that thing will go up, and that led to the price, contributed to the huge spike price that we all saw at the pump. The White House sent a letter to refineries asking them to add capacity, and they more or less said, we're doing everything that we can. This was a structural problem in the industry. And then lastly, here on the supply side, even if firms wanted to increase capacity, sometimes they can't because they don't have the material to do so or the employees to do so. They don't have the labor to do that. You can see how many say they have a significant shortage of steel, or how many say they have a significant shortage of people. It is quite dramatic to see this level of shortage of everything that they need to grow their business. Now, extreme weather is, for those who might not know, I love to study the weather. I've been doing it ever since I was a child, and so it's sort of dangerous to ask me to talk about the weather at any time, but it is always my delight to do so. But there has been some very extreme weather hitting the planet this summer. So in Europe, there was a massive heat wave over the summer. And the reason why that's important in this conversation is, of course, temperatures were 30 degrees above normal. It was over 100 degrees in Paris, which is very unusual. It means that air conditioners were blasting. So right as Russia's dwindling energy supplies, everyone needs to keep cool. And so that has led to this outsized demand for oil. And then this picture on the right shows China, where you can see this is the Yangtze River in China. It's Chang. I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but it's Chongqing, China, and it's a major city where they rely on hydropower, but there's a drought and heat waves, so they can't turn to hydropower, so they have to turn to oil and coal to provide their energy, and they're in an extreme drought. Now, this also has further implications on the manufacturing in the region, where manufacturers can't produce because they've been told to stop production, which has impacted the solar supply chain and also battery production, meaning alternatives to oil. So you can see how everything is connected. When one thing goes wrong, many other things go wrong. And this has led to a state of all energy sources being very tight. We don't have an outlet. Now, of course, we're traveling more with reopening. You may be traveling more this summer since many pandemic restrictions have been lifted, et cetera, and we feel more safer going out and about. And so it really boils down to this graph. And so let's move from left to right. So if we start right here, what this chart shows us is the oil inventories, or how much oil we have in storage. We have storage facilities all around the world to buffer supply and demand imbalances. And when the pandemic hit and the world shut down, storage went way up. It went up so high that prices went negative. People would pay you to take oil off of their hands. Now, ever since that moment, it's gone down, meaning we are draining our storage, and it's gone down so low that we're under normal storage capacity. And so before the pandemic, we were adding about 300,000 barrels of oil per day. And in May, we were taking out 400,000. So we were in a deficit. And this supply and demand imbalance is what is driving the pricing. Of course, the pricing is the inverse of this. It's been going up in a proportionate way. Okay. All right. So now with a picture of what's causing the energy crisis and some of the factors, I want to talk about the future a bit. I want to talk about where we headed, what is happening now with all of these shifts. So how are new energy supply chains forming and old ones ending? Okay, so we're going to focus on four things. One is the European energy switch. So Europe is switching where they get their energy. Two is that natural gas is becoming a globalized commodity. It's becoming almost like the new oil. Three, solar is expected to boom and already is booming, and that has put China and their supply chain in the spotlight. And then four, we're going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the impacts of that. So let's dive right in. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but we can see really a scary chart here that is driving the European energy switch here. And this shows natural gas pricing in Europe. Now, this is in dollars per MMBTU. An MMBTU is 1 million BTUs. 1 BTU is the energy required to heat 1 pound of water, 1 degree Fahrenheit. So 1 million of those. And that's how we price natural gas. So when the Russia-Ukraine war began, there was this huge price spike up to about $70 per MMBTU, but then it went back down to about 30. And then Russia's been throttling back the gas, and they went up to $90 per MMBTU. That is 25 to 30 times more than what we typically pay here in the US. So it's astronomical. If we zoom out on a larger time scale, we can see that it's 10x what Europeans typically pay. Okay, so they're usually around $8 to $10 per MMBTU. They were just at 90. It's come down a bit, but this is funneling through their economy and leading to tons of pain. Speaking of that pain, it's very bad. The European cities are going dark. There have been all types of measures taken to try to conserve energy. Of course, households are paying a lot more for energy. Small businesses are threatened with being unable to pay their bills. The Spanish prime minister is asking workers not to wear ties so that they don't need to keep buildings as cool. They can let temperatures rise in buildings. There's fines if you leave your shop door open and allow any of the cooling to leave your building. And this chart on the right would be funny if it wasn't sad. It shows the Google searches in Germany for firewood as the country scrambles to find any type of heating fuel that it can use for a potentially cold winter that could lead to some families not having the ability to heat their homes. So it's a dramatic, dire situation. Of course, we could talk about the economic impacts, recession, et cetera, but on a very real level, people's lives are being greatly impacted by this energy suffering. Now, of course, the suffering is caused by Russia pulling back their supplies of natural gas, which typically supply 40% of Europe's needs. They also typically provide 12% of their oil needs. Now, Russia is no longer sending in oil to Europe, or as much oil and as much natural gas to Europe, but they're diverting it now to China and South Asia. So that is a big change in the supply chain. Meanwhile, the US is sending natural gas to Europe. We're trying to fill the gap along with Qatar and other areas, other oil and natural gas producing countries in Africa. So you can see that instead of energy flows coming in to Europe from the east, they're now coming in from the west. This is a new development, and it's taking time to really set up and formalize and change the infrastructure routes. So the US is coming to the gas rescue. This is a major theme for us to understand. It's very important. We talk about the natural gas market going forward. It's interesting because in the early part of last decade and even before, we were building terminals to import natural gas. Natural gas, when you move it around, it's called LNG, liquefied natural gas. You actually have to cool it down to negative 160 degrees Celsius and turn it into a liquid. So it is kind of like moving oil around, but you have to do it in a particular way. But it turns out that with the shale revolution and the production of so much natural gas, people quickly realized that we could export it. And so we designed the terminals to export and not to receive. And that really took off in 2015, and it's been dramatically increasing ever since. Now, moving forward, we are expected to be the largest natural gas exporter in terms of additional capacity. We already are the world's largest exporter, and that lead looks to only continue. Russian projects are in question. Some of these other projects are in question as well. Qatar will probably move up a few places. It's important to note that we are a preferred supplier in the market because of our geopolitical stability and because of the surety of supply that we have. China and other countries in Asia, and of course Europe, want to do business with our US natural gas exporters. But this has implications for us as consumers. We already export 13% of our natural gas that we produce. And that percentage is only going to go up as we, of course, export more. And what this means is that our gas prices are going up because we have a new source of demand pulling those prices up. We're now exposed to global demand for LNG, for natural gas. And so our prices have tripled. They've gone up from an average of around $3 per MMBTU to $9 per MMBTU. Now notice we're significantly lower than Europe, which is why Europe partially wants to buy our gas because it's so much cheaper here. There's also another factor at play here, and that is our inability to switch away from natural gas. Natural gas provides 40% of our power, meaning when you go home tonight and plug in your devices at home, or even if you're sitting in your office right now consuming electricity, 40% of the nation's power comes from natural gas, and that is up significantly in the last decade. We can't switch that back to coal. We can't switch that to hydro. We can't switch it to nuclear. And so we've lost the ability to fuel switch as much, and so demand is fixed. And so we're very much dependent, demand is fixed here in the US, so we're very much dependent on demand factors outside of the US to determine our price now. And we didn't used to have that in the past. So natural gas is becoming like the new oil. And that is because other countries are following our similar development path, meaning they are going from coal to natural gas the same way we did, and renewables. So the whole world is looking to shift from coal to natural gas plus renewables. And some countries don't have natural gas, so they need to import it. And this is done to reduce pollution. Of course, coal produces a lot of air pollution in cities. You might have pictures in your head about pollution in Delhi, or in even in U.S. cities in the 70s, for example. And natural gas burns half as much carbon. Burning natural gas produces half as much carbon as burning coal. And of course, nations want to move away from that to reduce potential impacts on the climate. Now, all of our dependency on natural gas as a result is going to increase as electrification happens. Electrification meaning the conversion from gas cars to electric vehicles. You can think of it as you go from consuming a gallon of oil to plugging your car in and consuming a gallon of natural gas, right? Because now we're going to be dependent on our power grids. And so natural gas is the fuel in focus. And countries, importantly, are building the infrastructure to receive this. And that gives us an idea that this is truly going to happen. Now, I want to talk about solar. If you've come to our offices for a due diligence day, you know that we've have done work on solar, particularly the solar supply chain. This is a picture of what the supply chain looked like a year and a half ago, where we'll start here in China, where forced labor using the Uyghur people were being pulled into mining and making the input materials for solar panels. Those solar panels would typically be finished in the rest of China outside of Xinjiang province, which is the westernmost part of China. They would be finished outside of that area and then shipped to Europe and to the US or to Southeast Asia. Now, there's a split here in the supply chain because in Southeast Asia, when the US has tariffs on panels directly out of China, so they would ship them to Southeast Asia to eventually ship them to the US and avoid the tariffs. So they would send half complete panels to Southeast Asia to be finished there and then sent to the US. Now, as the world has woken up to forced labor, and we have also contributed our voice as well in publishing this report on forced labor. The Uyghur people are a group of people of about 12 million in this province that have been subject to imprisonment in max facility prisons. They've been beaten. They have been what many nations have called a genocide is what they're undergoing. It's been very brutal, the conditions they're living under, constant surveillance. There's been all types of human rights atrocities committed against them. And then they oftentimes go and do forced labor with some company that they're not aware of, but will go to get out of the prison system. And that unfortunately has wrapped itself into the solar supply chain. And some countries, such as the US, have responded. And this is what the solar supply chain looks like today. They've responded by putting up essentially a wall to products coming out of China that cannot be verified, that they're not made with inputs of forced labor. And so what this has done is incentivize movement outside of China and outside of Xinjiang in particular, for the supply chain to shift out into more visible areas where we can monitor the production. And Europe has also implemented new due diligence protocols, not necessarily laws, but more like best practices, though they might put up a law as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, as the US did. Now, this is significant. I have this 30 gigawatts here over the US. That's how much solar we typically consume in a year here in the US. That is equivalent to 60 million solar panels. So someone needs to make 60 million solar panels to provide our solar needs that are only going up from here. And so this is a critical supply chain for energy security in the future and for providing low cost, clean energy to the world. So countries are trying to quarantine off the forced labor only to Xinjiang and remove its impacts on the solar supply chain. Now, where the industry is going in the future, we'll look, well, before I get to that, it's going to this. But before I get to that, I want to say that the impacts have been significant with this trade barrier. So there's been 32 gigawatts of project delays. 64% of that is solar, and that's because of this trade barrier. Now, we agree with this trade barrier because we should not be consuming products made with forced labor. But as the supply chain adjusts, it's led to a very tight market. Panel prices have gone up, supply has gone down as companies are scrambling to comply with these laws. And so it's going to take some time for the supply chain to adjust, but it means that there's no easy alternatives. Energy everywhere is tight. There's no technology right now that we can turn to and immediately solve our energy needs. They either take a long time to build or their supply chains are constrained. And this is where we're headed in the future. Right here, the supply chain for the US is going to completely cut out China. There's going to be production built in Southeast Asia from start to finish to serve the US market. So we are free of any sort of involvement in China and potential forced labor issues. I think panels from China will continue to flow to Europe for some time, directly from China to Europe for some time. But this needs to be watched as well because they might increase their trade restrictions if the documentation out of China does not prove that they're not using forced labor. Now, India and the US are also going to be building a domestic supply chain. I'm going to talk about that more when we get to the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to have to wait till 2024 for this better supply chain to develop completely, but it is moving that way. Now, if we think about other technologies, zoom out for a second, let's think about other technologies. Nuclear, maybe we shouldn't say it's making a comeback, but it is going to hang around longer than maybe we originally thought, which is a good thing. Nuclear power can provide consistent, clean power to the world. France is investing 50 million to keep their nuclear power plants operating longer. If we look at hydro is at a weak moment right now. Many of the good sites along rivers, of course, hydro it relies on the energy and water. You have to block it and then slowly release it through turbines to generate electricity. Many of those good sites are already used, and with drought happening around the world, the ones that we do have aren't delivering for us, and so they have not been very helpful as of late. And some are being built in areas that are at risk of mudslides and other natural disasters. So that's not an easy outlet for us. Coal use has been surging because oil is so expensive. Coal use has been surging, and that is set to continue. And this is one area where the US can help companies overcome their sort of coal addiction, if you will, and use a cleaner natural gas. And that's part of the natural gas export theme here from the US. Okay, now the Inflation Reduction Act. So this act is going to produce an estimated about $370 billion in funding for for different energy technologies. I've put in bold here ones that I want to highlight for you real quick that I think the bill will have the largest impact on. So one, solar and wind. Of course, this will overdrive these credits. They extend the incentives for 10 years. Usually the industry has to deal with 2 years or 4 years and then worries that it'll go away. The industry is now going to have 10 years of incentives that could cover up to 50% of the capital cost of the upfront cost to build a solar wind project. Truly an incredible incentive. Hydrogen, this is believed to eventually be a fuel that can be used instead of natural gas, and for long haul transportation. If you think of trucks that need to constantly fuel, batteries might not deliver, but hydrogen might be able to do that. And then carbon capture. This is something to keep an eye on. Carbon capture, the carbon and capture incentives were significantly increased in this bill. And what that means is coal plants or natural gas plants that were otherwise maybe going to shut down or not be built could actually be built if they're outfitted with carbon capture. It might make economic sense to do so in the future as that technology improves, and the improvement would come through scale, and the scale would come through this incentive. So there could be some good things happening in that market that would change that dynamic for our power. So this bill doesn't necessarily kill oil or doesn't kill natural gas, for example. And then there's manufacturing incentives for making solar. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. There's incentives for buying electric vehicles and for also buying battery components. So for producing battery components. So all good things in terms of bringing the supply chain out of China and out of some of the higher risk countries of production. And then lastly, in the fossil fuel category, there's a methane fee for methane emissions. Methane is a gas that is emitted during production of oil and natural gas. There's a fee for that that could change the dynamics of the oil market. It might come down heaviest on small producers, whereas larger companies can invest in abatement, methane abatement and control, as well as carbon capture technology. So that could have a negative impact on smaller producers there. But the bill does have some things that are beneficial to the oil and gas industry. For example, tying the selling of federal land or the leasing of federal land to oil and gas producers with the leasing of offshore wind projects. So we're not allowed to do offshore wind projects if we're not allowed to do oil and gas projects. So they tie the two together to try to create a level playing field. Now, this is a study that shows, hey, just tries to answer, hey, how much more solar wind would we build as a result of this bill? And you can see it's a lot. I wouldn't get caught up in the particular numbers because it is a model that might not be right, but just directionally we can glean some good information from the folks at Princeton that put this study together. You can see that solar and wind go up, but notice, like I mentioned before, this purple here is gas with CC, or gas with carbon capture, and even a little coal with carbon capture. So the bill doesn't kill coal, it doesn't kill gas, it doesn't kill oil because of that carbon capture technology. We need to watch that because, like I said, it could have major implications. But we do expect a lot of solar and wind to be built. And then lastly, another thought that I would like to share, I wouldn't look at the exact numbers here, but just directionally what we're looking at. On the left here, we can see crude oil production in the US in billion barrels per year. That is expected to still go up slightly. And then on the bottom left, we have US natural gas production. That is expected to go up slightly every year. And then you notice around 2026, there's a cone of probability. It could go down a little bit depending on how much renewables are implemented or stay roughly flat. But on the right, I want to point out that whatever we produce and don't consume is most likely going to go to the export market. So in other words, there is now a structural support because we're getting more in the export business of oil and natural gas to Europe. There's now more structural support for these industries, even if the U.S. consumes less going forward because of renewable energy deployment. So that's something to keep in mind. And then lastly, the bill incentivizes solar supply chain development. This is the credits for each step of making a solar panel. There's 4 steps shown here. Now, the issue with the supply chain in China is that China controls 97% of the wafer production. The wafer step is right in the middle of making a solar panel from start to finish. It's right in the middle, and China has 97% of it. And of course, when you're producing in China, you're incentivized to buy materials from all over China to make that wafer, including from Xinjiang. What this bill does is it includes over 60% incentive for that wafer step. And so this is to bring that wafer step to the US so that we can hopefully compete with China here in the US with that production and move that supply chain that is dominated by China out of just being concentrated in China and exposed to forced labor, potentially, depending on how responsive companies are to take remedial actions. So this is one thing, a positive thing that I want to point out. Lastly, I want to talk just about our approach very briefly here, but it's important. When we think about investing in energy around the world and what the goal of environmental stewardship is and the impact that we can have through our investments, we really think about it in five major lenses. So one is we want to partner with companies. We want to look for companies and find companies that are providing low cost and efficient energy technologies, companies that are innovative, that are helping solve some of these this energy suffering, the energy pains that people are experiencing. How can we provide more energy to more people in a low cost way? Of course, low cost is very important for human flourishing. If it's too expensive, it's no good. And then we look for sustainable energy supplies. What are energy supplies that we can provide to perpetuity, that we can always use going forward? Of course, we look at reducing pollution. We want people to have cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner environments, and companies that take that seriously and that are actively involved in that. And then reducing greenhouse gas emissions to prevent possible changes to the climate. And then, of course, energy security. The world needs a secure, reliable energy supply. And so what this practically means is we want to partner with companies that are bringing energy to Europe, that are bringing first-time natural gas to developing nations to help them move from burning firewood for cooking that causes all types of respiratory issues to cleaner burning fuels. We want to partner with countries implementing solar and wind technology around the world to provide more energy supply. And so I will stop right there and we can
all right,
open
great.
it up.
Let's do some housekeeping really quick, and then we might have time for like a question. So Reggie, go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll go ahead and make an announcement about our upcoming event. So our CIO macro update. Many of you tune into that. That is on October 20th. That's where Finney Curavella, our co-CIO here, gives his quarterly views on the market through the 3 legs of the stool. Many of you are familiar with that. So be sure you can sign up for that at eventideinvestments.com/macro update, or you can scan that QR code on your screen. So Reggie, one question we got in, I thought you might be able to speak to is, are we seeing any interesting innovation in terms of scalable carbon capture solutions? Or is that just kind of a pipe dream that people are hoping that it happens? Or are you seeing anything on your end as far as giving you optimism there?
Yes, so we are seeing that. There's I would say 2 major things you need to consider with that technology. One is the effectiveness in actually capturing carbon. So generally, it's good to have sources that are very dense, but sometimes the the effectiveness, the ability to capture, for example, over 80 or 90% is lacking. So we need innovation there. And then two, what do you do with it once you have it? And building that infrastructure. The bottom line is that we can do it, but it's very expensive. And so we need to develop scale and more know-how in implementing this technology across different power platforms, like, for example, burning biomass or burning coal, to get those learnings and implement them at scale and lower the cost. But we are seeing incentives, and we are seeing different market-based mechanisms like a carbon tax, for example, that are supporting that market.
Great. And so in your scope might be more focused on investable opportunities, and this might fall outside of that. So feel free, if you don't know a lot about this next question, then feel free to just let us know that. But someone's asking about your thoughts on the fourth generation nuclear reactors. And as a part of that comment, he's saying that it's possibly the cleanest and safest green energy. Do you have any thoughts on that particular technology, the fourth generation nuclear reactors?
So I'm not familiar with maybe that particular generation, but nuclear in general, what people are excited about is nuclear fusion. That might be what he's talking about. And in the IRA bill, there's $700 million to go towards developing the fuel for that. So definitely keep an eye on that.
Do you see any potential drawbacks, or like what are the trade-offs there? Do you see are you optimistic on it, or do you see drawbacks on it?
Well, nuclear is a wonderful power source, but it does have some issues, of course, very well documented. For example, how do you store the radioactive waste? The other issue is just the level of expertise and spending you need to build such a facility that's complicated with so many things that can go wrong. I mean, the welds have to be perfect when you make a nuclear facility, and it all has to be inspected. And that has generally led to a lot of cost overruns, which means the final price of electricity they need to charge is so expensive, it doesn't really help us that much. And so it's one of those things where we need more research and development, which is happening, but it's more of a longer term thing. We, of course, are focused more on the technologies today that we can invest in today that are growing, like natural gas and renewables. But this is something that we are starting to watch more.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we have today. There's one more question from a friend of mine. He's just wondering if there's going to be bad weather in Dallas that's going to delay his flight back to Dallas. So I'll ask you that offline. For everyone else, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you soon, hopefully on the CIO macro update on October 20th. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.